Whether your business is small, medium, large, or extra large, there's a retirement solution for every type of business. oldmutualsuperfund.co.za.
Well, a lot of talk about business in the budget. Now let's get the reaction of business, or at least some representatives of business. Professor Raymond Parsons of BUSA, a special advisor, and Leslie Marsdorp, who's Vice President at Business Leadership South Africa. Good evening, gentlemen. Let's start with just an overview, and Leslie, perhaps you can go first. Your big picture reaction to this budget.
David, I'd start off by saying that it is a very positive, business-friendly budget in my view. I think you've got to take into account that the Minister of Finance did not have lots of room for maneuverability, if you like. You know, we're still living in very uncertain economic times. Growth is constrained, so he didn't have extra revenue, if you like, to look at, let's say, additional expenditure programs. So I think the Minister continued in the tradition of his predecessor of, being very pragmatic, wanting to make sure that we have a very sustainable fiscal path. So, the days of government looking at one-year budgeting is long gone, more than a decade now. So there's kind of a 3-year trajectory, and there's a lot more predictability, if you like, in government plans. Yeah. The fact that he was able to walk this tightrope without increasing taxes, I think is quite formidable, given that we are in a very constrained economic environment. But he did not come with any sort of proposals on the revenue side to improve taxes.
Yeah. Raymond, and building on what Leslie says, it's almost as if we take for granted now with Trevor Manuel and then Pravin Gordhan the excellence of the presentation, the process, the thoroughness with which it's all done. There can't be many countries in the world that do it as well. Perhaps the question is, but to what extent does it translate into reality on the ground, which perhaps raises questions about big picture, long term, the legitimacy of the budget?
Well, that is an important question. I certainly agree with what's been said so far. I think what is shared here is that everyone wants an economy which is bigger, stronger, and better over the next few years. And above all, the commitment to the National Development Plan does begin to inject more certainty and predictability into the policy environment, and this will be welcomed by business. I think we've got to accept that business will admire a skillful job done under difficult circumstances, and this was a very skillful job today, given the fact that he's had to balance the short-term requirements with a longer-term vision, because what the National Development Plan is now doing, both for government starting to do it and for the private sector, is to develop more long-termism in our thinking. We've been far too short-term. Now, he's got to bridge it under difficult circumstances. The fact that he didn't put up taxes, let me put it this way, he is firing a warning shot across our bows. He's saying, look, I can balance the books this year, but I'm not sure where I'm going to be in the next couple of years unless I get the NDP, unless I get the growth, unless I get the employment, and therefore I get the taxpayers. So I think that's the implicit message which came through very clearly, and I hope that his colleagues also perhaps picked it up as much as the private sector will have done.
Well, we always do want Pravin Gordhan's colleagues to listen to him more than they do. But there are trade-offs to be made in the ruling alliance if the National Development Plan is to get pushed through hard, Leslie. And one takes a particular phrase from Pravin Gordhan's address where he said, we need a significant increase in private sector competitiveness that's needed in the wider economy. And then you look at areas like agriculture and manufacturing, issues of minimum wages, just to take an example, where everyone who observes says there is a trade-off here. If you want fewer jobs, then raise the minimum wage. There are difficult, awkward trade-offs to be made. And of course, it's not Pravin Gordhan's job to make them, but it does undermine the credibility of his budget if they continue to be divided on how to proceed.
Absolutely. David, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think what we've seen towards the end of last year was just an overwhelming support for the National Development Plan. At the ANC conference in Mangaung, President Zuma gave it resounding support. He spent the better part of 10 minutes of his speech on that. He did the same with lengthy comments about the NDP in his State of the Nation address. But the budget is really where the rubber hits the road, and I think the minister has started to begin to signal that expenditure plans of government needs to be aligned to the National Development Plan, because the National Development Plan is only meaningful to the extent that departments are able to take a 5, 10 and a 15-year horizon of what they're actually trying to do. And it's not quite clear. It's early days yet to say that government has begun to make those trade-offs, but you're spot on. At the end of the day, you cannot continue to spend on all fronts and hope to create the jobs and stimulate the economy.
Yeah.
Those trade-offs will have to be made on a daily basis by government departments.
Yeah, Raymond, Leslie
I would
mentioned
add to that, yes.
he mentioned the rubber hitting the track. I don't think too much rubber has hit the track yet in the detail here. But just let's take Pravin Gordhan's comment where he said we need government and business in South Africa. He said, unlike Brazil, unlike many other countries, government and business don't work together. And he said if they could work together, we would see a different kind of economy. What's the problem, Raymond?
Well, look, I think if you look at the National Development Plan, it also lifts out this issue of the fact that the levels of trust are not what they should be between the private sector and government. And look, there are all sorts of reasons for that. But I think that if you look at this budget speech carefully, and you think back on some of the meetings that were held recently between business and government, I sensed a greater resonance in this budget speech about what should be done in order to create a more business-friendly environment, especially on the side of small business. Whereas before, it almost seemed more like, well, in passing, we'll do this or do that. It seemed to me it was much more of a sub-theme, if I can put it that way, in this budget speech. Yes, we do need to do this for the private sector, that for the private sector. This, in turn, I might say, will create the expectation that the private sector will begin to respond to this newer message that is coming through, because without the cooperation of the private sector, you will not have a success of growth, employment, and the National Development Plan. So quite clearly, there's a codependence here, and the sooner both sides recognize that fully, the better it will be for the economic performance of the country.
Right, Raymond.
To that, David.
Yes, Leslie.
Now, we're just going to say that it was clear the minister was trying to invoke this idea again about South Africans developing a shared vision, talking about shared responsibilities. He used that word of shared efforts between public and private sector a few times in the speech. So it's clear that there's a recognition on the part of government that there has been schisms in the relationship, and that we need to restore a better working relationship. But I think it requires more than words. There needs to be concrete programs identified around which this partnership can be reconstructed.
I think, yes. I mean, if I could add to that, I think the great hope of today and the commitment, the increasing commitment to the National Development Plan is that things that where you got an answer yesterday was no in terms of cooperation and participation by the private sector, tomorrow you might start getting a half yes, and the day after tomorrow a yes. Because quite clearly, it's not just a matter of rhetoric. It's a matter of solving problems jointly and moving the boundary between the public sector and the private sector in such a way that you make the mixed economy work better. And that's the challenge of the National Development Plan, and that's the challenge that the Minister of Finance put on the table today.
Right, we're going to pause the discussion now, gentlemen, and of course the budget estimates, I don't know if people have seen the budget estimates. It's a thing this thick which has all the detail of this budget, which we can't get into on this show, but a lot of that rubber hitting the track is there. We're pausing for a moment from Cape Town, and we're crossing to Into Properties. Chief Executive David Fischel. Into, an unfamiliar name, but I'll explain why in a moment, has reported revenues for the year up to £525 million from £516 million last year. The group's declared a dividend of 10 pence per share. Now we have on the line from London David Fischel, CEO of Into Properties. Into Properties is a new name, David, for what used to be Liberty International and then Capital Shopping Centres. Why the name change before we go on to what else you're doing?
Yes, we took a decision to change our name. The name was a bit clunky, Capital Shopping Centres, and really had no relationship to any of our centres, and then we had 15 different centre names and none of them were linked with each other. So we decided with 30 million customers, that's half the UK's population walking through our centres every year, that it made sense to have a common name for both the company and the centres. So what we'll do is put Into in as a prefix for each of our shopping centres. So like into Lakeside, into Trafford Centre, and off the back of that, we will launch a transactional website as well.
Right. Well, I presume that one of your new names is into Milton Keynes, because you've got a new shopping centre there, and the equity arrangements are interesting. Certainly opportunities for South African as well as British investors there.
Yes, Milton Keynes, the centre we've acquired there. I mean, it's a city we've long been interested in. It's a growing city, affluent, large car-borne population. It's growing rapidly, and all the retailers we talk about Milton Keynes as a very successful destination. So we're delighted to have got our hands on a shopping centre there, and it's a great shopping centre with all the tenants you want, like Hollister, Zara, H&M, Topshop, etc. We've financed it through a placing, and yes, we're very pleased that we were able to include South African investors in that placing, who were able to subscribe for the first time in Rand rather than in sterling. So it's a really simplified process for us of raising equity.
That is David Fischel, Chief Executive at Into, formerly Capital Shopping Centres rather, and Liberty International was the company it was known before. Interesting new investment opportunity there in England, in Milton Keynes. Now we go back to our panel in Cape Town, Leslie Marsdorp and Raymond Parsons, and they are still with us. If I could come back and start with you, Leslie, as Raymond finished off last time. Just to continue there on the legitimacy of the budget, a lot of what could happen is not in this budget, and certainly the tax, storing up a review of tax, that's to come. That creates or retains uncertainty about the tax regime. And the Minister said, well, we want to do it all together. We don't want ad hoc tax changes. But the fact is it's not in the budget, it's to come. And there are other things like the NHI, and he warned that unless there's considerably better economic growth, taxes are going to have to be raised for the NHI.
Look, I mean, I'd say, one of the outstanding aspects of budgeting over the last decade and a half in South Africa has been just the transparency of it, right? So government has managed to not just, publish the 3-year numbers looking forward, but also signaling what the medium long-term priorities are. And that specifically is where the large expenditure on infrastructure comes in. So I think the first point to make is that there were no surprises, there were no shocks, nothing of that sort in this budget, and it's unlikely that this new tax commission will come up with proposals that will be introduced in the 2014-2015 financial year. I think the National Treasury has mastered the art of sort of incremental reforms rather than introducing any sort of radical shifts to the system, if you like. I mean, it's only a decade and a bit ago that we had sort of single year budgeting, which introduced the elements of surprise. The day was always anticipated throughout the economy. Everybody were glued to their screens. Today it's very, very different, because you've got a sense from the medium-term budget policy statement in November, obviously, what the trajectory of spending would be. So to come back to your specific issue around taxes, whilst it introduces an uncertainty, it's unlikely that commission under Judge Dennis Davis will introduce proposals for the short term.
I think the way you should look at it really, David, is to say, if we are pressing government to align more and more of its policies with the National Development Plan, that must include your tax policy. And the way to do it is not on an ad hoc basis, that you produce a carbon tax out of somewhere, although admittedly that's now subject to quite intensive consultation, but that you ask a group to look at it in an holistic way, link it to what you want to do and the NDP, and say, come up with a tax regime that is now appropriate to the National Development Plan. And you must remember, the last time we looked at the tax system was 15 or 16 years ago under Michael Katz. Well, a lot has happened since then.
That's right.
So quite clearly, both in the world and in South Africa, I think it's the right thing to do, is to say, let's ask a group of people to have a look. Let's not do this on an ad hoc basis. Let's not administer any shocks to the system. Let's ask them to come up with something which no doubt will enjoy the benefit of all sorts of inputs, from stakeholders. Let's try and get the best of the tax regimes we can to underpin the goals of the National Development Plan.
Leslie, I want to pick up on another point there, the tax incentive for employment of young workers, which sounds good. And of course, when Pravin Gordhan says it, these things always sound that they're in calm hands and are going to work. However, that assumes that such a subsidy or arrangement to encourage young workers to get into the market at lower wages, it assumes that agreement will be reached on that. What are the signals that you're getting on whether COSATU's opposition to anything that might threaten the wages or undercut the wages of its members? Has that enmity softened? Are we going to have a real incentive scheme for companies to employ young people at below the union rates?
Look, it's a complex issue you are raising. I think the starting point is that all the stakeholders, labour, business, government, we are all in agreement that we've got to find ways to stimulate. We need targeted interventions to stimulate more job creation in the economy, because that remains the single biggest challenge.
But Leslie, we have to say that that's the old American phrase, mom and apple pie. You know, we always have done that.
That's exactly correct.
And one of the problems with this government has been that there are lots of good aims, but when it comes down to those choices, they don't make them.
That's exactly right. But I think, though, the minister has signalled that, and again, you know, there must have been some discussions at the level of the political alliance between the ANC and COSATU on this, because I listened very carefully to the words he used, but he has taken on board the concerns raised by Labour. He's very committed, David, to the implementation of the subsidy, because the feedback he's received from business is that this would stimulate the rate of the job creation. So in the next couple of months, I anticipate that there's going to be discussions at the level of NEDLAC and some agreement reached about the levels to ensure that this wage subsidy does not in any way undermine your existing collective bargaining structures and system, because that is really what COSATU is concerned about, the extent to which the wage might be used as a substitute. Instead of employers employing people at the full minimum wage, they then employ at this lower rate. But I think everybody agrees we need a particular measure to stimulate the rate of job creation.
Get people onto the jobs ladder and so on. Raymond, he first started talking about this in 2010, so we've now had 3 years of him trying to persuade his colleagues. Are you hopeful?
Well, look, I think from what I know of the discussions in NEDLAC and what the Minister said today, you are absolutely right to say that it's now time we saw action. I've said before, and let me say it again, if we could factor talking into the gross domestic product, we'd have been the fastest growing economy in the world by now. We really have to take the ball and run with it now. And in this issue of youth unemployment is an urgent and a pressing challenge. Take on board the concerns, try and do it in quicker than another 3 years, and let's try and see some action on this front during the course of 2013. I think business wants it, the government wants it, the community out there wants it. So, I mean, let's get on with it.
Leslie and then Raymond, to finish off our discussion, you obviously represent business to some degree, although it's not a monolithic constituency. It's difficult to represent in full. However, your constituency must come to people like you and say, well, what do you think of the budget? How should we, business, think of the budget? You're the guys who are talking to government and the unions. So what are you going to tell them? What are you going to say to business when they ask you what you think of this budget?
Look, I mean, I think, you know, we look for a couple of as themes, if you like, to take a view on the overall budget. The first one is government significantly increasing their expenditure? Is government therefore borrowing more in order to finance that consumption expenditure? Is government widening the deficit, etc.? On all of those fronts, is government raising taxes? On all of the kind of questions that I would ask and use as metrics, the answer is in the affirmative. In other words, the minister is clearly signalling, whilst the deficit has increased to 5.2%, he's signaled very clearly that by 2015 we'll go back to the 3% levels, which is, as you know, the more kind of sustainable rate that the IMF and most countries adopt. So government is not living beyond its means, and that's a very important point. In fact, the minister was actually quite emphatic. He said departments will have to reprioritize existing expenditure. They'll have to look for savings within their budget, and they'll have to look at ways of getting rid of wastage and corruption. And very interestingly, he's announced a new initiative within the National Treasury that will be specifically targeted at improving your procurement system. Now, as you know, there's a lot of inefficiency within government procurement. Government spends tens of billions of rands on all kinds of expenditure. So Treasury is taking a firm hand, or the Minister of Finance is taking a firm hand in wanting to monitor that expenditure and specifically root out corruption. So overall, what the message to our constituency is, government is living up to its commitments made in the National Development Plan, signalling where it's going and taking some tough stances.
Raymond, you've been in this business of representing business for a long time. What will you tell your constituents?
I would say to them, look, I think today a very important platform has been created for the National Development Plan and its various components. Bearing in mind that we're looking at 2030, which is why we have to start now, because some of this is indeed long-term and we need to think more long-term. There's a platform for greater cooperation also being forged here. It has great potential for a better relationship between government and business, given some of the things said in the speech. But above all, it also, apart from the budget speech and the National Development Plan, we must understand there are also some what I would call offstage noises over which this minister does not have control, such as labour stability. So we've got to take this message, this broad message in the budget, and extend it across the government machine to the extent that the government machine is involved, extend it when we talk to other stakeholders, where we want to develop more solidarity and we want to negotiate a climate within which business feels more confident to invest and employ. Now, I think what one can say to business is, look at the potential in the speech. Let's see if we can build on it so that we've now used this platform today for better things in the future, stronger things, and in fact, deeper commitments, both on the part of government and on the part of the private sector, to make this economy bigger, stronger, and better over the next 10 or perhaps 15 years.